staff and students. And many departments and organizations and individuals have organized events and initiatives and concrete climate actions, of course, for the Year of Climate Action. So if you want to learn more about that, please visit lakeheadu.ca/yoka. We'll put that in the chat after for you. And you can learn more about what future events or actions are lined up for us. So this year's research showcase is really featuring presentations by leading climate change researchers at Lakehead University and also other institutions. And we're so honored to learn from these researchers and the innovative work that they're conducting to respond to climate change. And we know that transformative change is really created and spawned by the accumulation of actions like these. If you're participating in the gamification of RI Week and you're looking to secure some of those prizes, the gamification code for this specific event is #YOKA, #YOCA. And I can also put that in the chat as well. I would like to recognize that in Thunder Bay, we are on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And in Aurelia, Lakehead University resides on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people and of the Rama First Nation. We know that those least responsible for climate disruption and greenhouse gas emissions, including many Indigenous and racialized communities, are the most vulnerable to its impacts. But despite or in spite of this, Indigenous communities have and continue to be active leaders. And there are many Indigenous authored resources to learn more about how you can further climate justice in particular. And I really encourage you to seek them out if you haven't already. One such example can be found within the Indigenous Climate Action Network. I want to really honor the fact that over the last 3 decades, especially, and even before, Indigenous peoples have advanced and advocated for some of the strongest climate policies and actions rooted in their rights, their language, culture, and identities. For example, a recent Indigenous Environmental Network report states that Indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed the equivalent of 25% of annual US and Canadian greenhouse gas emissions, which is substantial, and their work at the front lines has stalled many projects that could have accelerated emissions. We created the Year of Climate Action to be a platform which will bring together our faculty, our students, our staff, and our community members to listen, to learn, to share, and of course, most importantly, act on climate change and climate justice for many of the reasons I stated. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our presentation today titled Student Reflections on Climate Change Education Courses at Lakehead. And I will pass it over to the panelists to introduce themselves. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Lita, and thanks for such a wonderful and important land acknowledgement. I think our team, we had written a land acknowledgement, and the one piece we would add to that is that if our climate policy was able to look 7 generations ahead instead of barely half a generation, we would not likely be in a climate crisis. So thanks everyone who has found some time on this Tuesday to join our talk. I'm going to quickly introduce our research team, and then we're going to dive into our presentation. So I'm Ellen Field, and I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education. On the team as well is Paul Berger, associate professor in the Faculty of Ed, Devin Lee, PhD candidate in the Faculty of Ed, Courtney Strutt, an MEd grad and a current RA who's working on this project. As well, we have Carmen Vela, who's not here today because she is currently teaching in schools to help with the teacher shortage. But that's our research team. And as we go, if you have questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat, and then we'll try to address them at the end. So first off, I just wanted to quickly provide a bit of context on the role of higher education institutions in addressing climate change. And basically, the summary of this is that universities and university partnerships are really key actors in the sustainability challenges that we're facing in the world. And through research and innovation, through education of large segments of the population, and through public engagement, universities are important sites for fostering the knowledge, skills, and competencies required to address climate change and sustainability broadly. So I'll just speak really quickly to 3 of these reports. The first one, which came out last year, Universities Facing Climate Change and Sustainability. It's a very comprehensive review of the role and impact of universities around climate change. And it shows how sustainability in higher ed has predominantly been implemented through compartmentalized approaches, and that university leaders have an incredibly important role to play in translating what has often been bottom-up efforts into strategic approaches. So it's great that we have YOCA, but we need to continue this approach and really have the strategic plans in order to address the issues. And when I was reading this report, I really found myself wondering, will Lakehead's Year of Climate Action prove to be compartmentalized effort, or will it garner a whole university response? The second one, higher education in the world towards a socially responsible university. And this is through UNESCO, so it's so many different partners. And really, the article, again, focuses on how there are local lived realities that are specific to place, but are also influenced by global forces such as climate change or economics, an increasingly interconnected world. And that is really the role of universities to help address some of these differences and disparities and inequities. And this really does require university administrative leadership to take these approaches. And the last I just wanted to speak to is the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we talk about the SDGs a lot. I think it's important to just reference that these were developed by 193 countries. And it really is an aspirational agenda, if you've seen sort of the 17 goals, to address complex and interconnected problems for societies around the world. And the role here, like while the framework is very powerful in and of itself, the role that universities can play is the intersection of these 17 goals and the 169 targets, and this is where there's overlap and there's collision as to how do we actually reach these goals, because at times they're at odds with each other. And this is the role of universities to try to untangle, investigate, and critically question, how do we get there? So I just wanted to provide this for a bit as we start to sort of reflect and think about how Lakehead is, what we're doing at Lakehead in terms of our climate change courses, and also what we can be doing more as an institution. So go to the next slide, Courtney.
All right. Just want to invite people to turn their cameras on if you're not eating or not having a bad hair day and not in your pajamas and would like to. We'd be super happy to see the people we're talking to, but it's also cool if you don't want to. It's all right, but there's no assumption that we'd be just speaking to each other and names. The climate change education courses that we're looking at, the BEd course started in 2014 here as an elective. The MEd climate change course started in 2016, and they're both taught in multiple sections now every year, and as well as an interdisciplinary studies course that Ellen taught that was included in our study. The photos you see here, snow sculpturing and Salma Makwa visiting the classroom, are sort of representative of the sorts of experiential embodied things that we try to do in the classes. But I will say that in the classes involved in this study, the pandemic was a little bit of a constraint. A couple of them started face-to-face and went online right at the end, but some were asynchronous online and some Zoom courses. So that limited a little bit this sort of interaction. The courses are incredibly rewarding to teach. They have students in them some who are teachers already, some who are becoming teachers in all different grades and different subjects. So it's not all just science people, for example. And there are a lot of work to teach as well. And that's because our collective understanding of climate change, its urgency, ways to communicate about it effectively, ways to tackle a crisis, these are growing day by day. We keep getting new reports and new disasters. So we're really always moving. And Ellen and Devin and I endeavor to make the courses really discussion-based and activity-centered with embodied assignments, but also giving students choice. We use mixed methods, mixed media and multimedia sources as readings, not just all text, for example, and some of those are popular things. I'm just gonna, our learning goals for the courses are many and varied, but some key ones that we also focused on in this research are students will gain knowledge and understanding of climate challenges. Students will develop a sense of urgency and understanding of possible climate actions, and students will develop a sense of agency in their own ability to take action. But before moving on, I'm just going to invite Ellen and Devin, who both teach the courses, and Courtney, who took one of Ellen's courses and then has also been a GA for both Devin and I, to share one thing that is a favorite activity from a class. And I'm going to start by saying I've had students watch Greta Thunberg's speeches, 4 or 5 of them as readings. They're short, but they of course change always because she keeps doing new ones. And then after some discussion in class, I put them into groups and asked them to create a rap that celebrates Greta's impact and climate change activism. And then they come back, and it's, rapping on Zoom is a special thing, but it's always been fun and really, really neat. Ellen, how about something from you?
Sure. So one of the pieces that I really enjoy in the class is inviting students to be a group learning facilitator for one of the themes and the topics. So we engage in peer learning, and this can be hosting a speaker like Tim and Angela did when they invited MPP Solma Makwa into the class. So that was not me reaching out to that MPP, it was these students who were so inclined to do so, and really creating a learning environment where students can feel like they can bring in their own ideas into the class, especially around their own worries around climate change, so that we can address them.
Yeah, one of my favorite activities to teach is using a modified version of Tom Puck's ecological macro model, Keeping the Earth Warm, as an embodied way of learning about the basics of climate science, so natural greenhouse effect versus anthropogenic greenhouse effect, and then how that launches an interactive conversation about causes of climate change. And as a student, I really loved the challenge by choice nature of assignments, particularly one that was centered on communicating climate change with a broader network through the medium of your choice.
Thanks. And then I'm going to echo Courtney's mention of challenge by choice. That's one of my favorite parts of teaching the course because I see how it drives student agency, letting them engage with these themes in authentic and personal ways. And it really brings that passion forward for tackling climate change that I've been now lucky enough to see persisting long after the course is over. So I'm really most thankful, I think, for that aspect.
And we're on to Ellen.
I'll just provide a little bit of the lit review and research context for where the literature is at on these topics. So previous research studies on post-secondary climate change ed courses have really predominantly focused on knowledge and understanding. So they'll evaluate climate literacy. Some will also evaluate students' perception of risk of climate change and use those two as how they're gauging how climate change education is working. There's also an emergence of affect studies that focus on how climate change content affects students' experiences. And this is really an area of research proliferation right now. So it's looking at affect across numerous disciplines, so psychology, communication, social work, literary theory, education, media studies, gender studies, social work, allied health professionals. So it's really all over the place. And this is probably in response to levels of climate anxiety and these disciplines trying to engage with that. So we're really interested in situating the research in this literature. And so we designed it as a mixed methods informed by reflective teaching practice. And the aim was to have a better understanding of our students' experiences in our courses so we could be better instructors. And the study is comprised of a survey that was sent to students at the end of the term and a voluntary follow-up interview that was led by someone on the research team that wasn't the main instructor. And we felt that that was really important so that students could speak candidly and honestly. So there was 55 students who completed the survey and 22 who also completed a follow-up interview. The data was collected from courses that ran in winter semesters of 2020 and 2021 and summer of 2020. The total number of students that could have participated were 128. So we had 43% complete the survey and 17% complete the interviews. As well, we had several research questions. We were interested in a lot of different facets of what's happening with our courses. So the first one is, we'll focus on the first four for this research presentation. How do students' views on climate change shift over the course is the first one. The second, what knowledge and understanding do students have and gain? What is their sense of urgency and how does it change? As well as what is their sense of agency and how does that change from our courses? We also have two other research questions that we're still analyzing. So how do the courses impact students emotionally? And what makes the climate change education courses we teach unique and worth sharing? So we're going to focus on the first four for this presentation. Sorry, one sec. My slide is just taking a minute. There we go. So in terms of how we analyze this, we used something called the Six Americas framework to assess students' climate views. So respondents answered several questions about how worried they are, how important climate change is, their level of concern, and their perception of risk. And through analyzing these questions, respondents are sorted according to 6 different audience segments that have been identified by numerous studies dating back to 2008. This research analysis comes out of the Yale Climate Change Communications Center and George Mason University Center. So sorting respondents is a process called segmentation, which involves identifying relatively homogeneous subgroups that share similar psychographic profiles. So the 6 positions are alarmed. You can see 33%. The data you're seeing is actually the latest from the US. So this is not our data. So 33% of the US population is alarmed, 25% concerned, 17% cautious, 5% disengaged, 10% doubtful, and 9% dismissive. I won't go into all of the nuances of those different categories. They're fairly self-explanatory. The only piece that I will share is that the alarmed are convinced climate change is happening, human-caused, an urgent threat, and they strongly support climate policies. Where they differ slightly is that the concerned think human-caused climate change is happening, is a serious threat, support the climate policies, but they see that it could be in the far distance. So it's not necessarily imminent and now. And so that's probably the most important difference that I can speak to for those. So for our purposes, we were interested in applying this to see how the student view shifted between the beginning of the course to the end. And it's important to note that students completed the survey at the end of the course and were asked to then reflect on their positions on climate change, knowledge, sense of urgency, and sense of agency at the beginning of the course and at the end. So the data presented is not a pre and post test evaluation. This is at the end of the course, asking students to reflect on their experience at the beginning and at the end. So students' responses on their climate views at the beginning of the course show that 14 were alarmed, 18 concerned, 19 cautious, and 4 were doubtful. The doubtful respondents, again, do not think global warming is happening or believe that it is just a natural cycle and not a serious risk. So we'll just go to the next slide. Then we analyze students' climate views at the end of the course, and you can see the notable still shift. You can see in the visual very quickly. 49 students are alarmed, 5 concerned, and 1 cautious. So this shows that 45 out of the 55 students surveyed are in those top 2 categories of either alarmed or concerned by the end of the courses. And as I said, the nuance between them is just really that time piece of when climate impacts will be more severe. So overall, the data shows how these courses shift student views on climate change, its impact and urgency and importance. And then the rest of the data is going to provide a lot more nuance to this overall. Oh, and so again, this is the same data, just visualized differently, so we can directly compare the change in the student climate views. So first, we can look at the before course numbers, which are green, and you can see the distribution of students grouped mostly in the cautious, concerned, and alarmed. And then by the end of the course in blue, there were no students in the doubtful category and only one in the cautious. And most students had moved into the alarmed category. So again, showing that difference. Thanks. It's good, Cordy.
Through our surveys, we wanted to learn more about how students' knowledge and understanding on different aspects of climate change were impacted by the course. We would, of course, hope that in taking a course on climate change, students' knowledge and understanding would increase. But we asked for students to indicate their knowledge and understanding of scientific causes, physical impacts, political and economic aspects, climate justice, and ways to tackle climate change. So for each facet that we examined, we saw significant and consistent shifts from about 4 or 5 out of 10 to roughly 8 out of 10 at the end of course, as reported by the students. And in our follow-up interviews with students, we saw greater insight into these gains and of knowledge and understanding through students' own voices. So one student says, before the course, I was more focused on scientific issues like how climate change happened, what are greenhouse gases, a little bit about social or political issues. But after taking this course, I can understand that science explains how the atmosphere is changing, but that a big change is happening in the political or economic part of society. Another student tells us that you have to see how what we do here affects what happens over there, how we have to draw those lines for each other. And we have to find a way to connect subjects and build climate change into these connections, because that is the connection between so many of the subjects. That's what learning at school should be about. And lastly, a student told us, I doubted when people would say that climate change isn't real, but I wouldn't have been as confident to say it that it's false. Getting a real grasp of those things, of what those things are and how manageable it is to create change was inspiring.
A quick comment from me on this slide. Most people self-reported that before the course, they thought tackling climate change was urgent. At least many of them did here. This is an average of the Likert scale responses. But you can see that at the end of the course, it was almost universal that people thought things were urgent. And my experience has been repeatedly that by the third class, when students have had just encountered just 2 sets of readings, that their understanding of urgency is way up. So I think if you couldn't easily live in Canada without knowing that climate change needs to be tackled, but with reckless governments buying, building pipelines and major new highways and things, it would be very easy to miss the urgency, but a few readings fixes that. And I've heard things such as, I can't believe that things are this bad and the government isn't doing more, like in the third class. So the urgency comes up really, really quickly. And I would say, unfortunately, in the end of the course survey, 30 respondents placed themselves in strong agreement with I fear humanity will not do enough to prevent catastrophic climate change. And I don't mean it's unfortunate that the students chose those responses. I mean, it's unfortunate that there are strong signs that humanity will not do enough to prevent catastrophic climate change. And that being said, it's like we're a team, we're down 3-1 in the middle of the third period, and we're actually the Toronto Maple Leafs, but we're still not out of the game yet. The courses are not meant to rest on doom and gloom. We can and we must act, and we all try to communicate that really clearly. A couple of quotes on urgency from the interviews. Before the course, I didn't think climate change was really around. All I knew was that things needed to be done for future generations, but I didn't know how far in the future it would be. I thought it was out of my lifetime, so I just figured I would live life as normal, try and do a little bit better. But now I think climate change is an immediate danger. The urgency that I'm feeling is, why are we still talking about eventually rather than right now? It's late, we're almost getting to the point of critical mass here. We have to decide, do you want to live or die? It's as simple as that. It's extremely urgent. I would say it's the matter of every second. We have to act now. I just want to say that the content of the course follows the science that we're getting on climate change. None of us subscribe to the more fringe notions of human extinction by 2030 due to the Arctic methane bomb and none of us take a deep adaptation approach, like, you know, everything's going to hell, so we just have to give up and ride it down. All of us focus on climate solutions as well as the challenges, and the hope that comes from the massive mobilization of people in the climate justice movements that we've seen in the last couple of years. Though that being said, the latest IPCC report last week, the Secretary General did say that the lack of global climate leadership is criminal, and that's his words. So we do all believe this is extremely urgent. One more thing on urgency. We did ask people what was the most important parts of the course that led to them feeling it was urgent. And the themes that came up were global urgency, consequences, class discussions, and activism. And I'll just give you one quote here from the global urgency. Someone said, the math behind climate change really put the time frame into perspective and how urgent the issue is.
All right. Understanding students' sense of agency and how it changed through the experience of the course was also a focus of the research. Through this survey, students replied to a series of agency-related statements and were asked to rank themselves on a 10-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. As you can see, there was a high rate of strongly agree responses among the 5 statements listed on this graph. Included are statements such as, I feel motivated to try and do something about climate change. I know what I can do to reduce carbon emissions, and it's worth lobbying politicians about climate change. The high rate of strongly agree responses here indicate that the majority of students left the course feeling that they understood the ways in which they could affect change, which certainly was a goal of the course. Students were also asked to indicate from a list of options what activities they had taken before the course and because of the course, both during and in the future. This graph demonstrates that the biggest shifts can be seen in students' willingness to engage politically on climate actions through calling, emailing, or visiting a politician to urge action on climate change or attending a climate change rally or strike. The more individually focused actions, such as calculating one's own carbon footprint or reducing consumption, had less notable effects from the course. We feel that this data speaks to some interesting correlations with the course design. So for one, the first 5 actions were things that students had opportunities to do through the class itself, which made their light blue actions taken because of the course fairly consistent across student choice. But the high rate of in the future responses for the most political of the actions, so talking to a politician or participating in a protest, also correspond to an underlying message in the course. While personal action is important, the big shifts we will need to come from large-scale policy action. And through the voluntary follow-up interviews, we saw many students express nuanced thoughts about their experiences and understandings of their own agency in the face of climate change. One student said, I would say that climate change is on my mind as a conversation. Now, when it comes up with family and friends, I'm not really afraid to broach the subject. Another said, I was unaware of how much I had been pushed to inaction by my emotions about my previous learning on climate change. And so I think this class made me face my inaction and say, I bet you say you care about all these things and that you feel, but what are you really doing? And how can you do more? And how can you do better? My challenge to myself will be to find ways to become active. I know that I can't not talk about this anymore. It's too urgent. I think I'm more likely to take part in climate change actions and political actions for the sake of climate change because I've realized there's more ways to interact other than protest. It can be writing a letter, creating a petition, even turning off the lights. Those can all be considered different or varying degrees of climate change actions. And so I'll just note on this that on top of the growing understanding of the urgency and scope of the problem and students' increased confidence in sharing what they learned, many students also spoke about the ways in which this course broadened their understanding of activism, thereby making it feel more accessible and inclusive. So activism, in its broadest sense of intervening for the purpose of societal reform, is incorporated into the course to support students in developing a sense of agency as a goal and a theme of the course itself.
And lastly, we asked our students what was unique about the course and worth sharing. So we felt that this question would be really important to other educators and those engaging with our research. And here's what our students had to say. They said, yes, the course was very clear and provided information, while allowing students to draw their own conclusions. Another said, absolutely, I believe all programs should make this course mandatory. Everyone needs to understand the urgency, see the facts, get educated, because this is a topic that requires the entire world to be on board with. Otherwise, the worst is yet to happen. Another of our students said, yes, it is interesting because you're learning about the science, politics, and social aspect of the information. So you're really becoming an expert on all things climate change. And lastly, another said, this course is fabulous as it is relevant and so interesting. The framework for this course itself is worth sharing too, as it focuses on both theory and information and experiential learning. I find this to be a much needed approach in post-secondary that is very effective and progressive.
You're muted, Paul.
Still funny after 2 years being muted. Thank you. I would like to close, but before we close the presentation and then open the floor for discussion, questions and discussion, and also encourage people to be present and put their cameras on, by saying that I'd like to repeat what Seth Klein said in his keynote on Monday, and what I've heard author Kim Stanley Robinson say about students, which is that all of Lakehead's students' entire lives will be enmeshed with climate change. Yes, with the disasters and suffering that we've so far locked in, but also with the phenomenal transformation that we're only starting to see right now. There's so much wrong in the world that there's good work to do everywhere. There's so much knowledge and so many proven ways to get on with tackling climate change and its associated scourges that we just really need to get going. Everyone's impacted, everyone will be impacted, everyone has roles to play. None of us here in the presentation started as experts in climate change education, and we're still all on a steep learning curve, but we're really hoping that you'll join us. Thank you.
So maybe we can just open the floor for any questions folks have or comments. Perhaps you can type it into the chat or raise your hand, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Yeah, Lita.
Yeah, first of all, this is fantastic. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was really clear, easy to understand. I think you're doing amazing work. I guess I'm just wondering, how do you manage all the climate emotions that come up during this course? It seems to me like all of the research questions were fantastic, and what the students are walking away with is fantastic, but heavy. I sort of feel it in my own chest as I'm watching the presentation, and how much that is to hold. So does managing the emotions take up a lot of that course, and what types of methods do you use to do that?
I can go first and then others weigh in. I think actually when we first started this research, the emotions wasn't even a key question for us. And then as we got into the research, we found, especially in the interviews, there was all of this rich stuff here. And our teaching, as Paul outlined, we redesign our courses every year. And so while the research started in 2020, I would say our courses really shifted in 2021 for many of us, including the emotional dimension as well as the justice dimension. And so the course has changed over time. In terms of holding the space for climate emotions, when I'm in a face-to-face classroom, I find it a lot easier to have that read of what's happening with students, and to also create a community. Like often we do community values around open-mindedness, but also respect in terms of where people are starting and coming from. But in terms of the front on dealing directly with climate emotions, I'll often say the first 2 weeks tend to be hard in terms of the heaviness of the content. And then as the course goes on, we start to engage more directly in the solutions. And I still haven't changed my course design from those first 2 weeks of sort of sharing the basic climate science, as well as the urgency. And so I don't know if there's a way to redesign the course completely, but I find the first 2 weeks are the heaviest. And I send students a lot of messages saying, stay with it. If you need to go for a walk, go for a walk. I know that there's a psychological impact to the content. So, but I'll let others weigh in because I know we all have different strategies.
Don't have too many climate discussions. They always turn into a heated debate. So one of the things I do is I've expressly acknowledged that emotions can be heavy. I have readings. I've just put one in the chat. It's a Facing It podcast, Jennifer Atkinson, totally brilliant, especially episode 4. But I also try to use humor and bring in humor and say, like, this can be a heavy subject. The first year I taught it, on about the 5th week, one of my students said, enough with the doom and gloom. Like, when are we going to get to something positive? And I realized that, so I would say every year since, I've been putting more solution-oriented things in and positive things. And I do realize that it might not have looked like that too much from this presentation. But for example, I remember in Devin's class had a bunch of electric cars out behind this building and basically had a mini electric car show. And her students were invited down and talked to people who just, because they're keen on their electric cars, brought them in. So having also some balance and having the hopeful stuff and Greta and the Fridays for Future movement as well, I think helps to, we've got this is really, really serious and awful. And there's some hope that we're mobilizing. Humans are slow, but not stupid, as Paul Gilding says. So we keep that tension. And I'm not sure I do a nearly as good a job as Ellen and Devin with the emotions, but let's hear from Devin.
Yeah, well, I'm not nearly as funny as Paul, so I don't, I try to, bring a joyful atmosphere to the learning. And I think relationship building is really key probably for all of us who teach this course, knowing our students, trying to check in with where they're at. I know when I conducted a lot of the interviews with students, the follow-up interviews, they did say that, the learning was heavy, but that they felt very supported by Paul or Ellen in their learning. Anecdotally, I think since we've moved online with COVID, I have seen that students are resonating a lot more with the eco-anxiety and the climate grief. The first few years I taught the course, I didn't feel much engagement with those themes. And then this past year, I was just absolutely blown away with how many students just kept, mentioning that, bringing that up. So I think we're seeing shifts at large in emotions. And I think that's important for us to work through in our analysis. We have a lot of data still to go through on that, and we're sort of gonna parse that out into a separate piece. So, but yeah, for today, that's that. Courtney.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, just a sort of a separate piece, but that's something that students really came back speaking a lot about as well, was how helpful it was for the course to also speak about developmental readiness in regards to their students. So for those folks, many of whom, many students are teachers, how the discussion around developmental readiness for their students was really helpful in thinking for them how they translate this information that's been really emotionally difficult for them, perhaps in ways, and then thinking about how they do that in responsible ways for their students.
I think the only other piece I would add to that is I'm also pretty honest with my students, how I oscillate between hope and despair pretty regularly, that I'm challenged around what the future looks like. And I don't hide that. So sometimes that can be helpful for them just to sort of realize. And I know, I think it was Joanna Macy, maybe somebody else, but who said, it is a rational response is to feel climate anxiety. And so it means you care and you feel about the world. And so not to necessarily push that away. And I think, in future iterations of the course, I'll share the existential toolkit for climate justice educators that has a whole bunch of resources on how to deal with complex climate emotions. And so that's an area for me that I want to develop professionally, as well as how to manage with those complex climate emotions and not just go from despair to, okay, let's talk about solutions and hope, but actually acknowledge the weight of those emotions so that we can process them appropriately. And what that looks like in a classroom setting, I'm still trying to understand. So there's a couple more questions here. So Helly asked, she said, thanks, this is important work. that shall be replicated across any courses that include content about climate change across the university. Will the findings be available in writing for general perusal? Yes, this was our way of analyzing our data to be able to speak to it, and now we'll start writing it up for publication. So yes, it will be available. It's not out yet. The next question Connie asked, is this still the only climate change ed course being offered in a faculty of ed in Canada? How did you get the course happening in both the BEd and MEd, and what recommendations might you have for educators working at other universities in getting a course like this going? Paul, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I was acting chair for the undergrad program many years ago, and thought that it would be good to have a climate change education course. And there just happened to be a brilliant master's student, Natalie Garum, who was willing to teach it in the next year. And I asked the dean, and the dean said yes, and we put it on as a special topics course. And I always think that's it's a reminder to me that sometimes when you take on roles like being the acting chair, it seems to take a lot of time, but it also means that you suddenly have some privilege to make decisions. And so I like to remember that is when I'm feeling too busy, that the busyness partly comes with being able to make change. And so it's been great that the course was supported by the faculty. We have a faculty that I think identifies as being concerned with issues of social justice and the environment. So it was no problem once students came to the course to keep doing it. The master's course, I actually have a feeling that I thought Connie had taught the master's course, but she maybe had just said maybe it's a great idea to have one. And so I was the chair at the time that we offered it for the first time, and we just offered it as a special topics course. Again, it was well received by students, good enrollment, and now we've broadened out and have several sections and see it as a bit of a specialty here at Lakehead. I don't know of another course in a faculty of education that's particularly about climate change education. And I also want to acknowledge that Ellen was recruited by Interdisciplinary Studies down in Aurelia to also teach not a climate change education course, but a version of the climate change for students in that program. And we haven't focused in this presentation particularly on how we teach teachers to teach about climate change, because that differs across the sections as well. But it's been great to see this build. There's great support of the faculty. The special topics courses, the master's course is now being calendared, and it's in fact being calendared with pass-fail as the grading system, which works spectacularly well because people come in with all sorts of different levels of knowledge, and it to give grades in a course when I think some of us believe that grades are implicated or part of the problem that leads to the society we have and climate change. It's been delightful to not have to grade that. And the BEd course is making its way to be an elective with its own course code. And we've got an environmental education course in the BEd program that's mandatory for all students that should have some climate change in it. So we're trying to get things going, and we hope that, I said to some of the interviewees, I thank them because what they're telling us about what's good and what could change about the courses will help us write in ways that other people might decide that they could offer courses like this, that they would be useful.
Thanks, Paul. I see, Lise, you have a question. Please feel free to ask it.
Unmute. Okay, I've got questions in comments in two areas, and I hope I don't take us too far afield. I wonder, in your studies, if there's scope to be looking at, so first of all, what you're doing, I think, is absolutely necessary, fantastic. It is planting those seeds, it's laying that groundwork of knowledge for people to then engage and take action. So I'm just, sorry, I get tongue-tied sometimes. I think about very practical, real political dilemmas that are coming up. The Ring of Fire keeps coming up for me as a place that's going to be very contentious, but and have local effects. So part of me is asking, is anybody I know this is a bit outside of your purview, but is anybody doing research on all the implications of that project and what kind of political pressures could be brought to bear to take it in one direction or another? So that's one. And then the other thing is, I'm wondering, when you're talking about activism with your students and that sort of range of possibilities, I think about, because I am entering the political sphere this year, I'm running for office, and what I know is that even a progressive government that wants to do the right thing experiences enormous pressure not to do the right thing, not to move too quickly, and so on. So I wonder about what kind of pressure is needed that we can build at the ground level that is enough for a government to say, we have to do this or we're going to get turfed out. I hope you understand what I'm saying, is that the pressure that we bring to bear from the ground has to be greater than the pressure that corporations are bringing to bear. I think that's it. Thanks.
I'm gonna jump in first to start to answer it, and first to say that the ring, we have so much, I think, to do in a half course with climate that for me, Ring of Fire hasn't crept in, although it would be fascinating to look at also the climate implications, also the fact that Doug Ford got elected saying he was going to drive a bulldozer himself to make the road, and then now he's saying, you know, and he canceled all kinds of renewable energy projects. He got rid of the new charging stations that were supposed to spread across. It would have made it easy for people to own electric vehicles. And now he's saying we need the Ring of Fire because we need the minerals to build electric vehicles, right? There's very fascinating stuff that could be discussed in there, but time makes that difficult. The second part of the question I would say is, first, like it isn't a course specifically on climate change activism. And so activism is definitely a part of what we talk about. And we talk in my sections anyway, a bunch about power. And for example, today in the class today, we were talking about the property destruction at the Coastal GasLink site on Wet'suwet'en territory, where they're trying to, as you know, push a pipeline, a liquid natural gas pipeline through Wet'suwet'en land without permission. So the idea of the big systems and the government industry connection come up in the course, and I don't have an answer other than to build enough enough power, as you say, for governments to think they're not going to get elected again. And that might be 3.5% of people willing to be on the street in front of Patty Haidu's office. So in Thunder Bay, 3,500 people, not just 600. 600 filled the parking lot, but 3,000 would fill all of Red River Road, and it would be great. And if we're not going to stop these things in that way, the only other way I can see to stop them is by making the projects unviable, as those unknown people did by damaging some of the equipment that's building the pipeline. And that's a wholly different kind of circumstance if we're starting to talk about sabotaging new fossil fuel projects. But I also don't think, I would never say to my students, like, you're going to teach your grade 3s about climate change. Those kids are going to grow up and solve the problems for us. Like, it's way too urgent. We need to be doing things now. So I do want to give my students who are becoming teachers or who already are teachers the chance to decide themselves how to engage, knowing that their students are going to be enmeshed with climate change, but not waiting for students to solve the problem. It's like, we have to do this now. And we're not so far, not enough, but we've got the seeds, so we're starting.
I think I would just add to that. So I think Paul is alluding to this, and I think there's lots of ways in my course anyway that we talk about how to pedagogically engage in these questions around power and also critical thinking. And we know from research as well that teachers can feel uncomfortable that it's not their place, that they need to have a balanced position. And so I think for many of us, we challenge that, given the sense that what is at stake, and that as teachers, we have a responsibility for young people to actually talk to them in authentic ways. And so it's not necessarily you're driving a certain political approach, but you're at least recognizing that they need to be included in this conversation, and how to have that conversation in ways that are authentic to the science and developmentally appropriate, and that maybe do get into political conversations, but you can manage those as a teacher. You don't have to just shut that down. So how do you do that in a way that keeps people safe, that keeps it as an open conversation? And in many ways, you know, that's hopefully what schools can provide, right? Is that kind of like commentary to engage with the big questions of our time, rather than only cover the stuff that isn't political or that, right? So I think there's a real need for folks involved in climate change education to not necessarily feel like they have to always state their position individually and personally, but to know as a teacher and educator how to engage young people so that they can they can sift through these big questions. So just to provide that sort of nuance there.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions or comments? We've got a couple more minutes, but I also recognize folks are busy and we're coming up to the hour.
I'm going to just jump in again, though, but feel free to put a hand up or put something in the chat. But I wanted to pick up on what you said there, Ellen, because especially in the early days of teaching the class, and when we did research on the first iteration of it, people were enormously concerned about being political just by teaching about climate change. Just by teaching as if climate change was actually happening and we know it's human caused, they felt that was incredibly political. And that's not the way it seems anymore. And that's certainly not the way I approach it. Or, you know, the things that we know from science, we don't have to be neutral about. Things like the discussion about the probably Indigenous land protectors who did some property damage on the Coastal GasLink project. And those are a little bit more sensitive, but there's no question that I'm the one teaching it. I'm the one framing the discussion. And my personal belief is that those people are heroes, that they are doing exactly what we need in the absence of political action. And that, you know, within a few years, this kind of action is going to be inevitable if the curves don't start bending down. So the politics have changed a lot in it. And I also try to help teachers understand that they can take positions. They can't ask their students to take their positions. They can't grade students on whether they agree with their political positions. But I do think that it's important for us as universities. It's like Robert Fisk, the journalist, used to say, I'm unbiased on the side of the oppressed. You know, I think we have, at this point, we have a duty to be on the side of the species that are going extinct, the vulnerable humans that are already dying from climate change, the future generations that are going to be clobbered by this. We have to be on their side in pushing for change. And I don't think we have to apologize about that.
Well, we have a question from Sydney as to, and this is probably best put to you. So recognizing the urgency, do we foresee these courses being mandatory for post-secondary students in the coming years, or will climate change remain an optional topic? Do you have thoughts on that, Paul or Ellen?
I think Ellen might be the best one to answer that.
I mean, I think with the two documents I referenced in the beginning, and the first one being 2021, which really looked at how climate change education, or climate change broadly, is being taught in universities across the world, you know, the finding is really that it's still compartmentalized. And so it's really up to senior leadership at universities to see that this is something that they need to do. And Seth Klein, in his talk, sort of put out the call to say, you know, I'd love to see a research center in engineering that focuses on, you know, how to employ heat pumps and different pieces. And so I wonder when the time will be that students will choose what university to go to based on how you know, the quality of the climate change, or I mean, for any student, they choose that. I'm going to go to the university where I'm going to get a quality education in the area of my interest. And this topic is increasing, and the number of grad students that are in touch with us is a lot to come to our faculty anyway, to focus. And so I think our Faculty of Ed has a strong foundation, but how do we move this to all other departments? And I think Lakehead is in a particular place in this moment in time that we could really have some strong strategy and leadership to not just have the Year of Climate Action, but have this as an organizing principle for our university to some degree. So, and that's I think what we need to decide and what we need to push for, but it's really up to senior admin.
And I think it's like a climate change course, a generic one wouldn't fit the best for students either. Like I think in engineering, they need climate change from engineering perspectives. In English, they need a climate change from English perspectives, and so on. And we're actually inviting people in May to come together for a climate action symposium. I'm not sure what we're calling it yet. Lita would remember. But we're asking departments of the university to send people to talk for 2 minutes about what climate change means to their students. And we're really hoping to learn what different departments feel about that, but also to spark conversations in those departments, so that basically any student coming to Lakehead should have a lot of grounding in climate change and what it means in their career and their lives before they graduate from any program here. And I think there are pockets where a lot of that's happening. I know Graham Saunders is on the call, and over in geography, they do a bunch of that. But let's have it really permeate. You know, even things like criminology, when the world gets hotter, people get angrier and there's more conflict. There's ways that climate change fits into absolutely everything. And it's 2022, so it's time for us to be doing it in everything, I think.
It's getting hot. So I think we're at time. So
Oh, yeah. Okay.
shall we call it a day? Thanks everyone for coming out, attending the session. Have wonderful days, and do come to the Climate Action Symposium.